Hey everybody, today I'd like to share a little bit about NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. This legislation was originally passed way back in 1990, although in 2024 the government implemented some new regulations related to NAGPRA that include some actual consequences for those who do not comply with the legislation. Essentially, what the law does is it says that if museums are holding human remains or funerary items or items of important cultural patrimony, that they are obligated to notify the Native American tribe to which those items belong, and there is a process for their repatriation or returning the items. Initially, there was a problem because there was no consequence for those who did not comply with the legislation, but the new regulations that went into effect just this year are having a real impact, and there's a flurry of activity from and to tribes regarding their sacred items and the remains of their ancestors. I certainly support the legislation. I think most people do. But it is a little bit clunky and it is imperfect. So it's an American law, so it does not apply to anything held by foreign governments or private collectors. And a lot of cultural patrimony, human remains, all kinds of things are held by foreign entities and sometimes private collectors that aren't governed by the legislation the same way. And, the consequences that have been improved are still a little bit clunky. Once in a while, you have some really ancient remains, and it's not exactly clear which tribe, has claim to them. So there's a process for dealing with that where, the museum or collector notifies the tribe that they think the stuff is from. And then that tribe responds, we agree these items or these human remains are those of our ancestors, and we would like them repatriated. And then they also have to notify any other tribes. And if more than one tribe says we would like them back, then they set up what they technically call competing claims. And usually the tribes work that out between themselves, but there's an adjudicated process in case there's ever an issue with regard to that. For the most part, tribes aren't busy fighting each other over who gets to rebury their grandmas. They're usually cooperating with each other and supporting one another. But it does mean that there's a process. So, I sit on the governing board for the Minnesota Historical Society, and once in a while something pops up and they have to notify multiple tribes, and there's a waiting period, and then they can finally begin with the repatriation process. I've been on multiple sides of this throughout my life, and some people would be surprised at the impacts of this. So, for example, on the White Earth Reservation in northwestern Minnesota, there have been now 3 major repatriations of ceremonial drums to the community there. And when that first happened, the drums had been stripped away from Native families, acquired by collectors or the U.S. government. Sometimes the means by which some of these things were collected were really problematic. And one of the drums was actually repatriated, held by a church, and repatriated to the community. And another one was repatriated from a museum in a totally different state outside of Minnesota. And all 3 of those drums have been activated. And there hadn't been an active ceremonial drum culture at White Earth really since about the 1940s, when the last of their drums were taken. And so the repatriation of those drums meant that the people at White Earth, who are biologically related as well as culturally related to the families in Mille Lacs, went down there for many years, learned the songs, learned the prayers, and reinvigorated that part of the culture on the reservation. So the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act is also about keeping living cultures alive and helping Native people have access to their stuff. And there are many, many other examples of this. I know that I have a friend who worked at the Princeton University Library, and there was a young Pueblo student who got a job working in the library and was stunned when he came into the library to see these miniature statues, they actually call fetishes in English, that were sacred and used for ceremony at Cochiti Pueblo. And he immediately notified the librarian. This is pre-NAGPRA, and the librarian amazingly convinced the university to part with these items. Usually that did not happen. And he personally, the librarian personally, brought them down, flew into Albuquerque and drove up to Cochiti Pueblo. And he was looking around for the people he was supposed to hand the items to. And he was kind of amazed because there was nobody in the Pueblo, not a kid running around, tumbleweed blowing across the parking lot. And so he stopped and he's walking around holding these fetishes. And finally he hears a set of footsteps. Tuk, 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 tuk. And one elderly Cochiti Pueblo man who was dripping in sweat just went up to him and went like this to receive the fetishes. Every single member of the Pueblo was down at the kiva waiting for their repatriation and the revitalization of this sacred ceremony. And so we've seen many more things like that after passage of NAGPRA. It is a little bit of work for the museums to know and try to figure out what is sacred, what is not, and to deal with whose stuff is this, which is actually a little bit more complicated than you might imagine. But it is up to the museums to do their due diligence and do the right things. I think for the most part, this has been a shift in museum culture. Used to be that museums are very resistant to that. They're like, this is our stuff. We paid for it. We got it at an auction. We've had it for a long time, or we need to study these things for scientific purposes. But increasingly that culture has been shifting as they realize that we are stewards of public goods and we want to be here for the whole public and we don't want to be objects of controversy. And so this has been evolving rather than thoroughly evolved. And I think the underlying current that we all need to evaluate is that there's been a long history within colonization to look at those who would be colonized and treat their culture, their cultural artifacts, and even their bodies as objects. There's a word for this in the English language. It's called objectification. And it's part of dehumanizing people to treat their bodies, as things for display. And there are many, many cases where there have been things that have gone wrong and sideways, where Native people were denied even the bodies of their own grandparents to be returned to them. Many injustices. But I do believe that the law and the new regulations that came out this year are a good step forward, and I look forward to seeing a lot more action in the years to come. Miigwech.